It's Tuesday, it's 4:15, it's room 405. We're going to talk about DSC. If any of those things don't add up for you, then now's a totally fine time to say whoops and move to a different room. My name is Michael Greene. I'm the program manager for DSC and for what's now Azure Guest Configuration, and we're going to go through all of those details today. I want to maximize our time today and just put out there from the very beginning that if we run out of time today, we'll just schedule a side session tomorrow and keep on going. So it's 100% fine. Like, I want this to be as open Q&A and interactive as possible. If that means that we run out of time, it's no big deal. We'll just keep going tomorrow, and we'll just set up a side session. So everything is, I'm always dangerously close to breaking NDA whenever I present, because I'm a super open PM and really like working with the community. So I'm going to start with, before I even start talking, just selecting these 3 slides and hovering over the delete button, because I might take them out. Does anybody, I know that a lot of the people who are at the conference this week, it's your first year at PowerShell Summit, and I think that's really, really awesome. It's awesome that you got in line and got tickets before the people who wanted to come back. And I imagine what we'll do is we'll grow the conference at some point, and we'll just keep expanding. But I think it's awesome that you're expanding your skill set and adding to your career. Would anybody like me to take 2 minutes and explain what DSC is? And if you feel that way, it's totally fine. You're not wasting anybody's time. That's how our community works. It's 100% fine if we should start with an overview. Okay, let's do it. You can think about DSC as the ability to declaratively express an end state, and PowerShell provides the language abstraction for doing that. This was introduced in WMF4. It started shipping in Windows in Server 2012, I believe. R2, thank you. So for Windows Server, it's built in. For Linux, you download it from a repo and you can add it. It also requires OMI, which is similar-ish to WMI, but for Linux. As far as the community is concerned, DSC provides the engine that makes it all happen. You write the configurations, which I'm going to explain what that looks like, but you have these things called resources. And the community has been massively contributing to these resources via GitHub and PowerShell Gallery. There's, like I said yesterday, 1,400 resources now. So, of course, per application, you're not going to find 100% coverage. Like, literally at one of the Ignites, somebody said, yeah, I looked at DSC, but there wasn't a module for BizTalk, so I decided not to use it. And I was like, okay. But built in, you see the things, the coverage here. Those modules will actually solve a high number of problems, but then if you go through the PowerShell gallery, you'll find resources that suit more and more needs every day. So in terms of why would I even do it this way, imagine that you're not a scripting expert and someone has asked you to just go look at a file that says, how do you build a server? Most of us that have written build scripts in the past, we took lines like what you see at the top, and then we added another 1,500 lines. And a lot of it was just like, if you wrote it and you had good comments, you can kind of remember, like, that's why I did this, and that's why I set this registry key, and everything adds up. But whenever it comes to someone else reviewing your work in source control, because now you want to make a change, and ultimately it's just going to be the web.config file is going to get a separate entry, but you're dealing with all the XML and things like that. Whenever it's imperative script logic, it's a lot to go through. And someone who is looking at your script, maybe you got hit by a truck and the next day they inherit your work, they're trying to figure out what the heck was he doing here. If it looks like this, you're literally declaring the Windows feature backup, Windows-server-backup should be present. And I can come along and do a code review of your work, whether it's because we've got great DevOps culture and you're asking for team collaboration, and I'm looking at source control to approve a change request, and this is going to go out tomorrow and say that backup server should be absent. Or it could be that you got hit by a truck and I'm inheriting your work tomorrow, and I can look at this and say, yep, his intention was to put Windows backup server there. Like, no questions asked, that's what was going on. That's the core idea of moving to a declarative model. The way that this actually works, you are going to end up with a configuration script with many sections like the one we just looked at. And as you can imagine, as you scale out and out and out, complexity gets more and more and more and more and more complex. So there's cases where, in fact, that I was just looking at it earlier. Remember that demo yesterday where we converted the group policy over to a DSC script? That turned out to have 101 individual settings that were all being managed. So that creates like a 1,300 line script of a security baseline for that machine. In most cases, I would say they're less than 100 lines because you end up breaking those down into smaller pieces. And there are cases what we call composite resources where you can have configurations call other configurations, and you can just develop building blocks. So you can say, this is the way we always have our best practices described for IIS or for SQL or for remote desktop or on down the list. And that actually cues up what we're going to talk about for guest configuration really well, is thinking about these things in terms of groups of settings that turn into scenario type thinking. So those configurations get compiled, and it goes from being this really nice, pretty DSC PowerShell script into a MOF file, which is Managed Object Framework. Managed Object Framework, you can look at it and be like, yep, I see what that says. I know how to read that. I never want to have to write that ever, 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 because it's extremely parsable. It could lose all of its line breaks, and any machine is still going to be able to read it, but you just wouldn't want to edit it. And then that can roll out to nodes. You can provide, in this version of DSC, you can provide parameter input to the script, and you could say, I'm going to define this kind of as a role, and then I'm going to tweak individual settings at compilation time by providing anything. There are customers who are describing IP address and server name, and then they're generating via parameters 5,000 individual configurations, and they have every single server's complete set of details somewhere. Other customers take the approach of, we just kind of let names be names, and we let IPs get dynamically assigned, but we define the role details in the configuration script. There's no wrong answers. You're going to have lots and lots of tools, and as you start going through this, there's several projects that I would recommend looking at. But one of them is Datum, as you start getting towards the right-hand side. Datum was developed by Gail Colas, who's super active in the community, and he's actually working on contract with us right now, although his wife had a baby 30 days ago, so he's taking a little break. But he's managing the DSC community for us right now. So he's the one, if you submit in GitHub, there's lots of active maintainers. You could get comments from any number one of them, but he's the one who's actually going through in most cases and approving the PRs, making sure that we're accountable for issues lists, things like that. So I already used more than 2 minutes, but I'm going to skip these 2 slides, and that will speed us up. I'm going to skip ahead and talk about how have these things translated over to Azure Services. So when DSC originally shipped, of course, it started off just for Windows. There was a construct of pull and push. Pull meaning that it started off with Windows pull server, and you could put your configurations and your required modules on a service in Windows, and then as you deployed VMs, you just registered them to that service. And then all you had to do for each individual VM was tell at the time of registration, you're a web server, and it would just go get the web server config, and it would make it so. It would become a web server. You could also do push, which is where you deployed a VM, and then either locally on that machine or remotely, you were pushing the configuration to it. Somewhere around WMF5, I had to go back and look at the calendar dates, a service was created in Azure Automation to host that pull service. And I would say for at least the last year and a half, most of our investments in DSC have been in the Azure service around DSC. We've completely redone the UI in the last year. We've set it up so that you can actually author configurations from that service. I'm going to give you a very brief look at that. But just for anybody who is looking at not just DSC, but across the board, what's my overall set of configuration management choices? Not choices, but capabilities that are in Azure now. We're going to take a little bit deeper look at this one. But there is also an inventory service. So if you're just wanting to look across all of your servers and see what's installed, what services are running, you name it, there's an inventory and change tracking service within Azure Automation. The change tracking one basically takes the inventory data and just plots it on a timeline. So you can go through and see. The biggest case for this is we just had an outage, and my boss asked me, So what changed? Because everything worked yesterday and today nothing works. So can you just go figure out what it was that happened overnight? And you go, well, we weren't collecting information overnight, so I actually have no way to do that. This is a tool that would allow you to do that. We have a complete and actually recently updated patch management tool. So you can, both in Azure and on premises, register nodes and do everything from deploy patches, deal with exclusions and whitelist of patches. You can respect maintenance windows, you name it. So you kind of get where we're going. There was the entire System Center family of tools, and then we're building out services in Azure. At some point, people started asking, like, when do you have one for one? And we're getting really, really close. I would say the big difference is, frankly, distribution points for our hybrid strategy. But for within Azure VMs, of course, you have storage accounts and things like that. And we're looking actually at some additional options there. And then there are still lots of cases where you need to just run imperative scripts, even if you're declaring everything as code. It could mean that you need to, I like to think of it as transactional work. I'm going to reset a service account password, or I want to collect logs, or once a month, this application has to have something done to it that doesn't really declare an end state. It's more like just go out and recycle some stuff. There's just some maintenance activities that have to happen that tend to have a good working purpose for imperative script logic, and runbooks are the way to do that. What's interesting is we are one of there's probably less than 5 total vendors in the space that can say that they handle runbooks and inventory and patch management and imperative script and declarative configuration. And then, if you constrict that list further to as a service, then the list gets pretty small. So what we are adding and what we're going to look at in more detail today is guest configuration. I did a little bit of a talk on this yesterday, but I'm going to explain what this is and how DSC, especially DSC v2, has become a part of it. So let's first, you saw this slide yesterday, so I'm actually going to save a couple minutes by just moving to here. Before I do, I wanted to introduce, I would say, 3/4 of the engineering team that's working on DSC. Do you guys want to maybe just all stand up and then just each say hello, say who you are, and maybe what you're working on? We can start with Katie. We'll work this way. Ladies first.
Hi, I'm Katie. I work on a lot of our guest configuration calls and content right now.
So whenever you join the DSC community call, this is Katie. She's usually leading the charge.
Hi, I'm Bahit. I work on the DSC v2, and mainly I'm working on onboarding other solutions to use DSC v2, chain tracking and inventory and what we have currently working on.
I'm Mohit. I'm working with guest certificate.
Hi, I'm Anna, and I work on guest configuration policy.
I'm the one who claimed something in DSC not working. Engineering for DSC and customers. I'm Ashish. I mostly work on the guest configuration service side for all the Azure calls.
Very cool. The next section that I'm going to do is actually a little bit of how Azure Automation works if you've never seen it before. Then we're going to show how guest config works. I'll show that working live. And then we're going to walk through some of the new commandlets for that. Before we do, I wanted to do the flip, like the opposite side of the coin for what we just did with the engineering team for anybody who's been using DSC. And can we just spend like 5 or 10 minutes on this? We don't need to spend like a whole hour on it. Would you mind sharing some details about how you're using it? Because for the purpose of, they've been working on it for multiple years in many cases, and it would be really awesome for them to know if you're using it, what you like about it, specifically some scenarios where like you feel like it's really helping out. And if nobody wants to share any stories, I totally understand. But
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we use DSC in my work to deploy new VMs for our developers. So we have a fully functional base OS, and then we actually use Jenkins form for enterprise build. And then we start the job in Jenkins, and that creates the MOF file automatically. Puts it on the machine, executes, starts the configuration, executing. And all the output comes out on the Jenkins console.
Oh, cool.
And then we
So your build logs are a forever log of how every server was built.
pretty much.
That's neat. That's really neat. Yes, sir?
We've got some baseline configurations that we use just to kind of stand up servers.
Yeah.
Which, this is web service, it's not a web service, it's a particular application server. So once that's done, we start deploying apps to it. We're orchestrating all that with obviously deploy right now.
Oh, yeah. That's cool.
So it helps us step through environments, gives us a little bit of reporting, and I guess that's kind of where I've been searching for
Yeah.
a good solution. I've played around with the report server, but I don't know if that's quite
Yeah.
what we're looking at.
Yep.
So that's kind of why I'm here.
Okay. That tells us a good one to look at for policy. Yeah.
Yeah, we were
Awesome.
using ESC quite a bit. Company I work for, we've been doing a lot of acquisitions, which has brought a lot of
Huh.
remote sites on board. And so when we acquire somebody, one of our first things we do is we bring in some new hardware to the site, and then we deploy just a standard Hyper-V server, a set of common services like file services, mail controllers, DHCP services, that kind of thing. Stand up those VMs. And so we use both the runbook mechanism to do some of the initial bootstrapping, build up stuff, and then we use DSC to kind of maintain it going forward. And we're starting to do the update management too on that slate of stuff.
Wow. So do you have like data files that you populate before you go to each site? Whenever you figure out like this is the anomalies per site?
So this is kind of just like, these are just kind of treated as like beachhead servers. Like we aren't
Oh, I
trying
gotcha.
to change any of their infrastructure. We're just kind of bringing our infrastructure, kind of a landing pad to get some commonality there. And
Sure.
to bring our domain into that local space.
Very cool.
ESC brings that just instant consistency.
I like it. Yes, sir?
We're using Azure Automation DSC, and we're planning to configure as much as possible configuration as code. So basically, most of our existing policies will be migrated to Azure Automation DSC. All the nodes have some roles which are dynamically generated, so we're using role-based configurations and assigning them dynamically, like somebody said. We also use Jenkins to generate these things and dynamically upload them, compile the files on premises and upload them to the Azure, and then assign them dynamically.
Wow. Very cool.
So we use DSC to deploy all of our client environments independently, so every client unit gets their own name for us, Exchange server, file server, and DSC deployed all the server build and function process, but we're not using it on the record because our support teams do not have the skill sets to maintain that. So we do like the configuration data file that we go for each environment, or that includes how smaller systems like DSC show.
I think we first talked about this like 2 years ago out in the hall right here. So these are end user workstations?
No, it's all hosted server environments.
Okay. Very cool. Makes sense. Awesome. Yeah.
Using ESC to actually enabling the locker of animals, like basically workstation. And we're actually looking to use ESC to make sure that this particular agent is being small.
That makes sense. Yep.
We use it for functional internal services like print servers and a couple of other application-specific services. We use the AWS DSC solution, which integrated with the systems manager.
Yeah.
So we hook it up to the order scaling group triggers. So when your service needs to either do a rolling deployment or scale up, it'll just automatically apply the DSC config and build up the service.
That's cool. We need to get somebody to do a PowerShell Summit session on the AWS service.
I think Andrew will do a little bit of that tomorrow morning.
Okay, cool. Come over. Awesome. Yes, sir?
I helped develop an application automation framework for Chef.
Uh-huh.
As our application automation. And we have a way where you can basically plug in DSC configurations when you want to automate your ASP.NET application. You can plug in a DSC configuration that'll set up IIS, or maybe you want to configure your SQL Server HA, DSC
And some of the, I'm trying to think how it works. Like Habitat calls DSC for like common Windows configuration details.
Exactly right. So like we have an agent that runs on the application server, and then it'll just, so you put your DSC configuration. We have a whole templating engine too, so we can template out some configuration settings into your DSC configuration, and then it'll just call the else and have it.
Yeah. Very cool. No. Go ahead.
When I was at Chef, I helped maintain some of the chef code that would call desired state configuration, or wrote some cookbooks that included some DSC resources. And then before that, the first production deployment of desired state configuration. So
Yep.
I played around with it in the early days as well.
Yep. Cool. Oh, awesome. Yeah.
We see last year, Azure made some role-based configuration for domain controllers, file servers with DFS, etc. DHCP servers with scopes and scope properties.
Yeah.
Those kind of things.
Wow.
It was a little bit time consuming to set up, but eventually went off very well.
Well, thank you all very much. Number one, for using DSC, and number two, for sharing your stories. And there's a few more stories around the room that I know of that are pretty fascinating. So if you get a chance to talk to the people in the room, definitely share war stories, because there's some pretty massive projects going on. And it's interesting as you go through the progression from configuring a first server to X number of thousands of servers. Everybody hits their head on exactly the same spots at some point, so the stories and the sharing is really good. I will give you a very quick tour of, let me check the time, of, we're doing great, of Azure State Configuration, just in case you haven't seen it, and then we're going to focus in on guest configuration. So this is the DSC service. I just took these screenshots earlier today, so they're not perfect examples of everything, and I didn't cover everything. I just wanted to give you, in case you hadn't seen it before, especially some of the changes that we've made just in the last year. So this is what the state configuration pane looks like now, the dashboard. So you can see across the top you've got nodes, your configurations that you're managing, the compiled outcomes of those. We also plug directly into the gallery. One of the things Johan did for us last year was to take lots and lots of the example configurations that are out there in all of the resources developed by the community and start bringing the examples through into the gallery. So one of those that I grabbed just earlier today was the certificate request for an SSL certificate. So there's a certificate DSC that does all kinds of cool things, including exporting certificates and making certificate requests and things like that and handling it automatically. So I imported that into the service from the gallery. Whenever you click on it, you can go through and view the source. So here's an example of a little bit more complication. This is still just one node in the configuration script, but it's saying, go contact that server. I'm going to need a certificate for this web server. Here's the properties of what that should look like. And you provide a credential object that's actually managed by the service. So your secret store can be there in the service. When you click on compile, you can actually see which configurations are available in the service. If you've gone through and compiled it multiple times, you might find that you're compiling the same configuration with perhaps different properties, so you can keep track of what's available in the service. And so now you can see that it's compiled. It's the first one on the list, but still not assigned to any nodes. You can see when it was created, when it was last modified. So you've got a bit more management than what was ever there in Windows Pull Server. You've got a complete reporting interface, so you can go through and see that, yes, every 15 minutes, this node checked in. It showed that it was compliant. And then you can see for each of the individual resources. So in this case, it's just looking at the account policy for like one setting for passwords on the machine. In this case, if it had lots and lots of different resources, you can see that and verify that each one of them was checked and get some metadata about the machine. Okay, that was a very quick whirlwind tour. That's okay. Yes, sir?
Can you use that with on-prem servers?
Yes. Yep, and it's actually the same process as when you register a Windows Pull Server. You just provide the URL and the key, And then it's instead of, so it's on that left-hand pane, you'll find a table of contents item for keys, and you can get that information from there. The other piece that I left out that we just added is this compose configuration at the very top. And so basically for any of the modules you've imported, if they surface composite resources, then you can just pick from them and then their properties become a web form. And you just fill out the properties. If it provides a validated list, then it becomes a dropdown, and then you can compile the configuration and do it that way. And that includes your own resources. So if you import your own modules and they contain composite resources, you can do things like maybe standardize your security configuration. Everybody should just check the box to include it and set it to enabled, and then they fill out the details for their more application-specific components. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that that's where the most of our DSC work over the last year has been, specifically into onboarding, getting that interface to work really well at scale. We have customers that have over 8,000 VMs registered to that service, so getting that dashboard to be highly filterable was a big request. So what we've been working on really for the last, we break things into semesters, so for the last 9 months, in addition to the state configuration service is the guest configuration service. Whenever you go into the Azure browser view and you go to all services, type in policy, and you can dock it there by clicking on the star whenever you find the search results. You can then navigate to Azure Policy. Azure Policy started as the ability to look at Azure Resource Manager, which is the API for Azure, and understand as things were getting deployed or inspecting things that have been deployed, could we build some rule sets around this? So you get these organizations like big enterprises, hundreds of application teams, and somebody is like responsible for saying, I'll be the person that ultimately like reviews who's spending money on what. And they get pretty nervous at the idea of all these application teams just having like free, like, yeah, just go ahead, light stuff up, guys. This should be great, without any boundaries at all. Like they want them to move as fast as they can, but maybe just put some safeguards up so they don't make, whoops, I deployed a VM that cost $50,000 a month. My bad, that kind of a thing. So the idea was to audit at the time of ARM deployment. Just it comes in as a JSON file. Just when it hits the API request, it comes in as a request to the API. Just look at that and like literally validate against a rule set. So it's things like these are the SKUs, like the sizes of VMs that we're going to allow. Or there's common things like everything should have a tag that says who the owner is, because a lot of people use that for billing applications. Or we only allow storage accounts in these geographies, or never allow public IP addresses on VMs because we only want to work in private networks, things like that. So it's just guardrails. But those are all Azure Resource Manager settings. So we were the first team to go outside of Azure Resource Manager API, gather information, and bring it back in a way that Azure Policy could keep track of. And DSC was just a really good fit for this. We recently had like a really big customer tell us that just doing audit, like just being able to see across the board that configuration details are consistent across VMs will allow them to move 3 times faster, because they can now, like their process for releasing those servers into production can now just be completely automated. They can look at the audit details, but they're not really having to force things on developers, so that the app teams can still use Chef, Puppet, Ansible, or DSC, or whatever makes sense. They just care about verifying the end before it gets released into production. So very quick tour of the interface, and then we'll focus in on how PowerShell works in this and how DSC content works for this. So if you go and look at our definitions, what you'll want to do is change 2 filters. One is the type. Just change that as a drop-down list and check initiatives. And then for your category, select guest configuration. There's lots and lots of policies there, and you're going to want to filter this down to just the ones that apply to virtual machines. And this is going to be pretty small text, but you can definitely check this from your own machine. This list is growing week by week. In fact, I think probably next week we'll see it grow again. One of them that we're going to be publishing pretty soon, 2 of them that'll be of interest to you. So you can see everything here from password policy, audit what's inside of the VMs for applications that are installed, certificates that are going to expire. I mentioned yesterday machines that haven't been rebooted. Who's in the administrators group? Is it joined to a domain? You can see if IIS is using TLS 1.2 or not, things like that. Under the hood, these are all using DSC for Windows. For Linux, it has a DSC resource to drive Chef Inspec. So all of the settings are just coming out of Inspec profiles, which is just a popular audit language for Linux. A couple of these that are going to be coming soon, we're going to start the process of retiring out the password policy in favor of an entire configuration baseline. So it's going to have in the neighborhood of about 300 parameters with default values for each of them. And so if you wanted to look at something like, let's compare this to STIG or CIS baseline or NIST and things like that, you could actually just come in and take one that's following best practices that we've recommended, compare it against your list of controls, tweak it a little bit and assign it, and you would actually not have to do any real authoring. If you wanted to move that parameter management out into hierarchical data and do that through ARM deployments, you definitely can, but you won't have to write the entire configuration yourself. But you could go take those policies and make small changes to them and use them as custom content, which is one of the things we'll be looking at. Another that I think you'll be interested in is we're going to add a policy to audit compliance of DSC v1. So even if you're just using the DSC extension, maybe you're not using the service today, but you've got VMs and you just want to deploy your configuration, such as auto-enroll in that certificate, for SSL or for TLS, and then use Azure policy to confirm that that node is consistent. That's another way that you could do it. So we're going to get into this area where we're sort of like in the middle between the transitional process, and there'll be multiple right answers, and that's just the nature of keeping backwards compatibility and introducing new stuff. So there we go. There's a closer view of that text. So the way that you, yes?
Yes, sir. Is meant to be a replacement for policy for the schema.
Sort of. Yeah, so the question for the recording is this meant to be a replacement for group policy? Long term, I think so. I mean, there will be scenarios where people in like virtual networks inside of cloud environments spin up domain controllers and keep on using group policy. Since this is only auditing, there's very low risk of friction. So the conflict detection isn't really a problem when you're just doing audits. You could even use this to verify that group policy did what it was supposed to do. I think as you move towards more immutable servers, where if it's not configured the way I want, I just knock it over and deploy another one, then things like domain accounts become more and more of a hurdle towards rapid deployment models. And then maybe something like this comes along as just the way to handle it. But it is, as far as I can tell, the best source of content. It's like every organization has group policies. And if you can just export those and use them, then it becomes just an easy thing to plug into.
Yep.
Can you create triggerable events off of fields and bodies, like send to the equivalent for Azure, not as much?
You can, because all of this gets written to the Azure activity log, which can trigger just about anything, honestly. Like it can call you on the phone and read the environment to you. One of the things we're really interested in is, I know, I don't know, that's a good question. But one of the things we're really interested in is, should we write additional information to the activity log? And then we get into all kinds of stuff like, if you want the current value of the machine, could that possibly contain sensitive data? So we're trying, like right now, we would just say, it's non-compliant, you should go to the portal or go look in the commandlets and figure out why. We're trying to figure out, do you want more information and exactly what that'd be. So if anybody wants to talk about that.
Right, I'm more thinking what you're just talking about. There's an error you got a large web deployment, I don't really care about one machine. Send a trigger event, wipe it out, and push out a new build of that machine to replace it. That's kind of what I was.
That would be a good sample that I could put together. I like that. Cool.
Great question. The answer is we will soon be releasing more information in this area. We have a plan. Probably within the next couple of weeks, we'll start talking about the hybrid for this capability. And I'm super excited actually about how that's going to work. But I probably shouldn't say too much more than that. But I can go have a couple beers later and I'll tell you all about it. So if you're doing an assignment, I just wanted to point out you can assign this at different scopes. You can go across an entire management group. You can go to a subscription. You can go to individual resource groups. You can even exclude individual machines. So if you're thinking about how you would do this at scale, if you're working in an organization and you've got lots of subscriptions, you can absolutely audit across a really big scale. And then in that case, I was saying like it's a web server policy. Maybe I want to exclude my database machines. I'm going to speed up just a little bit so we can get to the demo. For policies that accept parameters, those can be defined either as code at the time of deploying the assignment through a CI/CD process or in the portal. And so for custom content, you describe that. In fact, one of the latest things for our commandlets is if you've never done it before, working with policy, creating parameters for policy, creating policies in general is pretty complicated. And so the latest version of the guest configuration commandlets just take a template, create the entire policy for you, and then you just pass in a hash table of what your parameters should be, and it even completely scaffolds out your parameters. So we take everything, like the entire process of getting this here, and it's all automated through PowerShell. And so the commandlets for that are pretty nice. And I have a working repo that I'll share with you for an example of how that can be done via CI/CD. So when it comes to getting the details out, if you go in and you're looking at the compliance, I'll go into an individual policy. In this case, maybe you want to verify that the certificate that you're managing using DSC hasn't reached a dangerous expiration window. The trick to this, by the way, I'll explain greenfield, brownfield later, but the trick to this is whenever you get to your policy, when you're looking at the initiative compliance, you'll find that we actually have two policies. One that deploys the extension so that the VM can be audited. The other actually looks at the audit results. If you click on that, you'll see these guest assignments. So there's the certificate expiration. And whenever you click on that, there's the VM name down that center pane. When you click on this View Resource button is the last piece of the navigation. And we're actually going to look at making this a simpler path to get to that in the near future. This is where you start to see the connection between what you were doing in Azure Automation before with DSC and using it in guest configuration. So obviously you can see the likeness that's come over in the UI, but if you look at the details, in this case, that policy only has one setting. So it's looking at the DSC type was certificate store in brackets, so that probably looks familiar from DSC configurations. The resource name was certificate store 1. That setting was non-compliant, and the reason is the thumbprint, the certificate with that thumbprint actually is within 30 days of expiration. So you definitely could have DSC v1 being used for the enforcement, and you can keep on using that and can kind of trust that learning that and developing the expertise is something that you can do and that will lead you forward. You could even start using guest configuration built in, which is DSC v2, to audit not only is DSC v1 compliant, but were the results following through with what you expected. And we've got lots of ideas on what we could extend this. So for custom content, you technically could use any tool because it's all just DSC resources under the hood. You can think about the way that DSC was a platform for Windows to move to the cloud. Similar construct here. DSC can just be the data plane platform that enables any tooling you want. So our ultimate goal here for configuration management is just to make it a democracy. You can just have the DSC engine execute any tool. Whenever it comes to it, we're just starting to look at how we want to do enforcement of these settings, which is our next semester project. And the idea is if a customer wants to use Chef or Puppet or Ansible or DSC or something they built themselves to deliver those settings, let's just get out of their way and help them move as fast as we can. So we're going to continue looking at this, and you'll keep seeing DSC as a platform for enablement within Azure that drives these outcomes. And that might even include like DSC v2 calling DSC v1. We're still investigating all options that will give us this path to transition without losing backwards compatibility.
Is this everything free?
So for in Azure, it's 100% free. When we announce the hybrid solution, there'll be more information there. I would vote for free, but we'll see. We'll see. I actually don't know the answer yet because it was still being decided. So my vote was for free.
Yes, sir.
Our configuration manager CIs, configuration items, are they implemented with DSC?
Yep. Yep. So let me show. I'll show the architecture and I'll show an example of a content package. And then I need to hand it over. Yep, perfect. What time does this session end? We're going to run over about 5 minutes, if that's all right. Actually, I'll hand it off to you pretty quick. I just want to show the architecture real quick. Yeah, this is what's actually happening behind the scenes. So for those of you who are super familiar with Azure, actually, if you want to bring your laptop up, we'll start making the switch, and we'll take full advantage of your time. So you have GCRP, Guest Configuration Resource Provider. That's the actual cloud service. And you have a new extension called Guest Configuration Extension, and then how things are moving behind the scenes. The reason I wanted to point this out is this is built on the lessons we learned managing DSC service already. Today we have a DSC extension, and you can use it to push configurations or to register to the service. The way the service works today for state config is you put everything in there ahead of time, and then you just use the extension to register to it. It's really clear from talking to people that simple is better. So the way that this works in the guest configuration realm, that extension actually doesn't require any parameters. You just associate it with the VM and turn it on just by saying in your deployment template to deploy the extension. You don't have to tell it anything at all. When it wakes up, it authenticates as the machine itself to the service and basically says, do I have any jobs to do? So what changes is that guest configuration resource provider is just referencing a URI where your content packages, which for custom content are just the same, that's a zip file with a DSC configuration in it. And it's telling the VM where to go get it, and then the VM starts reporting status. But the interesting thing is, this is all running in PowerShell core, and each of those just basically comes down into its own job folder. So they're each handled as their own configuration. So when we start looking at things like, should we do partial configurations and things like that, we can actually just handle multiple configurations natively. And we take all the requirements for those and just handle them as a package for that job. So it clears up a whole bunch of the things we have in user voice today around DSC. There's no better time to fix problems than whenever you get to rebuild everything from scratch, right? So I'm going to hand off if you want to talk about what it looks like to get results from this platform out of PowerShell.
So along with the beautiful UI that Michael just showed, we also provide a PowerShell module. The PowerShell module is called as az.guest configuration module. You can get this module in the PowerShell gallery. So what this module helps us is to get the compliance status. So imagine you have thousands of VMs or hundreds of policies assigned to the resource group, and either you can go onto the UX and see okay, what all VMs are compliant, non-compliant, versus, or else you can just use this the PowerShell commandlets. So the first PowerShell commandlet that we have is get AZ VM guest policy status. So here I'm providing the scope of my policy. So for my resource group name PS demo and the VM name demo VM, what all policies have been assigned, and along with the statuses, it will give us that status. So here you can see there are two policies assigned. The first policy is it is looking for a specific time zone policy. When a VM is created, say I want a specified time zone, which is non-compliant in this case, whereas the second policy it is looking for a specified application, if that application is installed on the VM or not, whereas that is compliant. So for whenever a policy is non-compliant, we also give the compliance reason. Here you can see the expected time zone on the VM is Pacific time zone, but the actual time zone is Central time, and that's the reason this is non-compliant. The next commandlet we provide is to get the history of the policy. This is something you will get only from the commandlets. On the UX, we don't show the history data. So the policy, the commandlet is get-az VM guest policy status history. resource group name again like PS demo. So just for, so what does this commandlet do is like the VM is sending out reports every 15 minutes and we are storing those reports for last 14 days. So this commandlet will give you like all the reports that have been sent by this scope, like by this VM for this resource group for last 14 days. Either you can get all the reports, but for this demo purpose, I've given this flag which is like show only change. So what this will give us is like whenever the compliance status was changed, it will just display all those reports. So for example, here you can see like the installed application policy, it was always compliant and the latest report on 430 is still compliant. But whereas the specified time zone policy, it was like non-compliant on 427, got compliant on 429. Again, on like current status, it's non-compliant. So you can go back in time and look at that specific report because with this, we also get the report ID. And what you can do is use the first commandlet, like get az VM guest policy status, and it has a flag like, and you provide the report ID. So right now what I'm going to do is provide the report ID of the non-compliant policy, which was like non-compliant on 427. I need to know the reason, like why it was non-compliant on 427. And we can just look for the compliance reason. Oops.
Because we're watching. Oh, it's
No.
report ID to add at the end of the very.
Oh. Okay, so here you can see like this was not compliant because like on 427 again the policy is expecting the time zone to be Pacific time zone, but it was actually time zone was set was to UTC. And all these commandlets, they are giving you like output is like the PowerShell objects. So you can use this commandlets and write like simple automations on top of this commandlets. One of the simple automation that I have written is like I want to get given the resource group name. I want to basically like get all the policies which are assigned to that resource group and list the VMs which are non-compliant. And I want to know like, okay, and I want to output that thing into a CSV file so that I can generate a report in Excel sheet. So you can use this commandlets and like write a script on top of that. Here, like you can see, like it got this report is generated out of that script. So here you can see like for for that specified resource group, I have like 2 VMs. Again, the policy that is not compliant is again that specified time zone policy, and then you can see like the status is non-compliant, and the reason like one VM is not compliant because the time zone is set to central time zone, whereas the other one is set to UTC. So in this way, like you can write like your own automation using these commandlets, and you can even like kick off like jobs, like oh, just go and do something on that VM if it is non-compliant and so on. So yep, that's it from my side. Thanks, Mike.